What if I told you that spiritual predators don't just attack randomly? What if they study you first, mapping every weakness, every routine, every emotional trigger for weeks before making their move? Elena Rodriguez thought her strange experiences were just stress from work. She had no idea that something was systematically cataloging her life, building a psychological profile so detailed it could predict her reactions before she had them. By the time she realized what was happening, it had already identified 7 specific vulnerabilities. The question isn't whether spiritual entities hunt humans, it's how they choose their targets. And Elena's story will show you exactly how that terrifying process works. The most sophisticated spiritual predator tactic in history was perfected thousands of years ago, and it's happening to people right now. Are you next? Elena first noticed something was wrong on a Tuesday morning in March. Not wrong in an obvious way, nothing dramatic or Hollywood scary, just off. She'd wake up feeling like someone had been watching her sleep. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and sense someone just left? That's what her entire apartment felt like for 3 days straight. Most people would dismiss this as stress. Elena was managing a major product launch at her marketing firm, working 12-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination. Of course she'd feel paranoid. Of course her mind would play tricks. But here's what most people don't understand about spiritual predators. They're patient, methodical. They don't announce themselves with doors slamming and objects flying. They start with reconnaissance. Elena began documenting everything. Tuesday. Woke up with the sensation of being observed. Wednesday, came home to find her apartment exactly as she left it, but somehow different. Thursday, caught herself checking over her shoulder constantly at work. By Friday, she was questioning her sanity. Perfect. That's exactly what it wanted. See, spiritual entities that hunt humans don't operate like wild animals. They function more like military intelligence operations. Phase 1 is always surveillance. They need to understand their target's patterns, emotional triggers, daily routines, and psychological weak points. Elena was being studied like a lab specimen, and she had no idea the entity wasn't in her apartment. It wasn't hiding in corners or lurking in shadows. It was observing her from a different dimensional space, cataloging every detail of her life. How she reacted to stress, when she was most vulnerable, what made her angry, sad, or afraid. Elena thought she was having anxiety attacks. In reality, she was being systematically profiled by something that understood human psychology better than most therapists. What Elena couldn't know was that her case wasn't random. Spiritual predators select targets based on specific criteria: high-stress individuals with strong willpower, people who are spiritually sensitive but not protected, and those who live alone with irregular schedules. Elena checked every box. She was perfect prey, and the hunting process had officially begun. By week 2, the entity had Elena's entire life mapped down to the minute. It knew she stopped for coffee at 7:23 a.m. every weekday at the same Starbucks. It knew she always took the stairs instead of the elevator. It knew she called her mother every Sunday at 6 p.m. and that these conversations usually ended with Elena feeling guilty and emotionally drained. But here's where spiritual warfare gets truly sophisticated. The entity wasn't just observing Elena's external behavior. It was studying her emotional patterns, her decision-making processes, her psychological responses to different stimuli. Every time Elena felt overwhelmed at work, the entity noted exactly what triggered that feeling. Every time she felt lonely in her apartment, it catalogued the specific circumstances that created that vulnerability. Think about this strategically. If you wanted to manipulate someone, what would you need to know? Their fears, their desires, their insecurities, their daily routines, their emotional cycles. A human predator might spend months gathering this information through conversation and observation. A spiritual entity can absorb it directly by monitoring your energetic and emotional output. Elena started experiencing what she thought were weird coincidences. She'd think about calling in sick, and immediately her phone would ring with a work emergency. She'd consider going out with friends and suddenly feel inexplicably exhausted. She'd planned to visit her parents, and her car would develop mysterious problems. At first, she rationalized everything. Cars break down, work emergencies happen. Fatigue is normal for busy people, but the entity was already implementing the second phase of its strategy: subtle influence testing. It would plant a thought or emotion and observe Elena's response. If she resisted, it would note the resistance method and adapt. If she complied, it would escalate the influence slightly. Elena was unknowingly providing real-time feedback on which manipulation techniques worked best on her specific psychology. The most chilling part was how precisely the entity understood Elena's personality type. She was a problem solver, a rational thinker who prided herself on logic and control. So the entity didn't waste time with obvious supernatural phenomena that she'd immediately recognize and research. Instead, it created a pattern of small explainable incidents that gradually eroded her confidence in her own judgment. Elena began second-guessing every decision. She'd stand in her kitchen holding coffee, wondering if she actually wanted coffee or if the desire came from somewhere else. She'd catch herself taking routes to work that she didn't remember choosing. Her own mind was becoming foreign territory, and the entity was creating detailed maps of every corner. This brings us to the first law of spiritual warfare, the mapping principle. Spiritual predators always conduct reconnaissance before attack. They don't strike randomly. They study, analyze, and create detailed psychological profiles of their targets before making any aggressive moves. Here's the analogy that will help you understand this forever. Imagine you're a house, and a spiritual predator is a professional burglar. But instead of just checking if your doors are locked, this burglar spends weeks studying your schedule, learning when you're home, discovering where you hide your valuables, figuring out which security measures you actually use versus which ones are just for show. By the time they break in, they know your house better than you do. Elena's entity was that professional burglar, but instead of stealing objects, it was mapping access points to her consciousness. It studied her emotional security system, identified her psychological weak spots, and learned exactly when and how she was most vulnerable to influence. The terrifying truth is that most people never realize they're being mapped. They attribute the strange feelings, weird coincidences, and subtle mental changes to stress, imagination, or bad luck. Meanwhile, the entity is building a comprehensive profile that will allow it to manipulate them with surgical precision. Here's how to identify if you're being mapped. Unexplained feelings of being watched. A sudden increase in coincidences that seem to block your plans. Thoughts and desires that don't feel entirely your own. And a growing sense that your mind isn't completely private anymore. If you experience 3 or more of these signs simultaneously, you're likely in the reconnaissance phase of a spiritual hunting operation. Elena was about to learn that mapping was just the beginning. The entity now had enough data to move to phase 2, active psychological destabilization. If this is haunting your mind, stop now and hit that subscribe button. Why? Because what comes next will shield you against spiritual predators, and if you don't subscribe, the algorithm will hide these defense tactics from you. Week 3 began Elena's descent into psychological warfare. The entity had completed its reconnaissance and was ready to test its findings. But spiritual predators don't launch chaotic attacks. They implement systematic destabilization campaigns designed to erode their target's mental stability while maintaining plausible deniability. Elena's first sign that something had shifted was her sleep. Not insomnia, that would be too obvious. Instead, she began experiencing what sleep researchers call non-restorative sleep. She'd get 8 hours, but wake up feeling like she hadn't slept at all. Her dreams became vivid, exhausting narratives where she was always running, always searching, always one step behind something she couldn't identify. The entity was attacking during her most vulnerable state, REM sleep, when the conscious mind's defenses are lowered. It wasn't giving her nightmares, those would be too memorable. Instead, it was corrupting her sleep architecture, ensuring she never achieved deep, restorative rest. A tired mind is a compliant mind. During the day, Elena began experiencing what psychologists call decision fatigue, but artificially induced. Simple choices became overwhelming. Paper or plastic, regular or decaf, take the highway or surface streets. Each decision felt monumental, exhausting, impossible. The entity was overloading her decision-making pathways, knowing that a mentally exhausted person becomes increasingly suggestible. Then came the environmental manipulation. Elena's apartment began feeling hostile in subtle ways. The temperature would fluctuate just enough to make her uncomfortable, but not enough to blame faulty HVAC. Lights would flicker occasionally, not dramatically, just enough to create subconscious unease. Appliances would make barely audible sounds that kept her on edge without being obviously supernatural. The genius of this approach is that Elena couldn't point to any single incident as proof of supernatural activity. Each event was individually explainable, but collectively they created a state of chronic low-level stress that kept her nervous system in constant alert mode. The entity was essentially gaslighting her through environmental microaggressions. Most insidiously, Elena began experiencing imposter thoughts, ideas that felt like hers but somehow weren't. She'd find herself considering actions completely foreign to her personality, quitting her job impulsively, cutting contact with friends, making major life changes without planning. These weren't commands or obvious external influences. They felt like her own thoughts, but they carried emotional signatures that didn't match her psychological patterns. By week 4, the entity had Elena precisely where it wanted her, exhausted, confused, and beginning to doubt her own judgment. This is when spiritual predators implement what I call the influence escalation protocol, a systematic increase in mental manipulation designed to normalize progressively invasive psychological control. Elena started making uncharacteristic decisions. She'd always been health conscious, but suddenly found herself craving processed foods and skipping workouts. She'd always been social, but began declining invitations and avoiding colleagues. She'd always been financially responsible, but started making impulse purchases that didn't make sense. Each change felt like a personal choice, but when she tried to remember why she'd made these decisions, the reasoning felt fuzzy and unclear. The entity was exploiting a fundamental vulnerability in human psychology. We trust our own thoughts. When an idea appears in our mind, we automatically assume it originated there. Spiritual predators use this assumption to insert foreign impulses into our mental stream, knowing we'll interpret them as authentic personal desires. But here's where the entity's reconnaissance phase paid off brilliantly. It didn't try to make Elena do things completely opposite to her nature. That would trigger immediate resistance. Instead, it amplified existing tendencies in destructive directions. Elena was naturally driven and perfectionist, so the entity pushed those traits toward obsessive overwork and self-criticism. She was naturally independent, so it pushed that toward isolation and paranoia. The psychological term for this is parasitic thought insertion, but spiritual warfare takes it further. The entity wasn't just planting random thoughts. It was systematically reshaping Elena's personality by magnifying her weaknesses and suppressing her strengths. Her natural confidence became self-doubt. Her healthy boundaries became rigid walls. Her normal caution became paralyzing anxiety. Elena began experiencing what felt like multiple versions of herself competing for control. There was the Elena who wanted to stay home and hide, the Elena who wanted to quit everything and run away, and the original Elena who was desperately trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. She felt like she was losing a psychological civil war, but she didn't understand that enemy forces had infiltrated her mental territory. The entity was also conducting reality testing, introducing small supernatural elements to gauge Elena's response. Objects would be moved slightly when she wasn't looking. She'd hear her name called when no one was there. Electronics would malfunction in specific patterns. Each incident was designed to test whether Elena was ready to accept supernatural explanations or if she'd continue rationalizing everything as coincidence. The goal wasn't to convince Elena that supernatural forces existed, not yet. The goal was to create a state of constant uncertainty where Elena could never be sure what was real and what wasn't. Uncertainty breeds compliance, and compliance was exactly what the entity needed for the final phase of its operation. This reveals the second law of spiritual warfare, the Destabilization Doctrine. Spiritual predators don't attack your reality directly. They attack your confidence in your ability to perceive reality accurately. They create psychological instability that makes you doubt your own judgment. making you increasingly dependent on external guidance. Here's the more intense analogy. Elena's mind had become like a smartphone being hacked by an expert cybercriminal. The hacker doesn't announce their presence or crash the system immediately. Instead, they slowly corrupt the operating system, alter the apps, redirect the GPS, and modify the data streams. The phone still works, but nothing is quite right. The user knows something is wrong but can't pinpoint what. Eventually, they stop trusting their own device and become dependent on the hacker for navigation. The entity had successfully corrupted Elena's mental operating system. Her thoughts still felt like her thoughts, but they were being filtered through hostile software. Her emotions still felt genuine, but they were being artificially amplified or suppressed. Her decisions still felt voluntary, but they were being influenced by a foreign intelligence that understood her psychology better than she did. The most terrifying aspect of destabilization warfare is its subtlety. Elena couldn't point to a moment when the attack began because there was no dramatic incident. Instead, there was a gradual erosion of her mental sovereignty, so slow and systematic that she adapted to each new level of influence without realizing she was losing ground. Warning signs of destabilization include chronic fatigue despite adequate sleep, making decisions that don't align with your values, feeling like multiple versions of yourself are competing for control, increasing isolation from supportive relationships, growing paranoia or anxiety without clear cause, and the sense that your own thoughts aren't entirely trustworthy. Elena was about to discover that destabilization was merely preparation for the entity's true objective: complete psychological colonization. If you're watching this far, you are different from most people. Prove it. Leave your like now and subscribe, because people like you deserve to know all the tactics I'll reveal in upcoming videos. Week 5 brought Elena face to face with the entity's ultimate objective: psychological colonization. This wasn't about harassment or fear. This was about establishing permanent residence in Elena's consciousness, creating a parasitic relationship where the entity could feed off her emotional energy indefinitely while controlling her major life decisions. Elena woke up on Monday morning and for the first time in weeks felt completely normal. Rested, clear-headed, optimistic. The weird feelings were gone. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The strange coincidences had stopped. She felt like herself again. It was a trap. Spiritual predators understand a crucial psychological principle. Relief after prolonged stress creates gratitude and lowered defenses. Elena was so happy to feel normal that she didn't question why the improvement was so sudden and complete. The entity had deliberately withdrawn its pressure to create what military strategists call a false peace, a temporary cessation of hostilities designed to make the target vulnerable to final assault. For 3 days, Elena's life returned to perfect normalcy. Better than normal, actually. She felt more confident, more creative, more socially connected than she had in months. Work projects flowed effortlessly. Relationships improved. She started planning a vacation, considering a promotion, thinking about dating again. The entity was showing her what life could be like under its management. Then, on Thursday night, Elena experienced what she would later describe as the most terrifying moment of my life. She was making dinner when she suddenly realized she hadn't made a single decision all week. Every choice, what to eat, what to wear, which route to take to work, what to watch on TV, had felt effortless because something else was making those decisions for her. She stood frozen in her kitchen, holding a wooden spoon, understanding with crystal clarity that her mind was no longer entirely her own. The thoughts felt like her thoughts, but they were being guided by an intelligence that had learned to mimic her internal voice perfectly. She was experiencing what spiritual warfare experts call consciousness hijacking, the gradual replacement of authentic free will with expertly crafted psychological puppetry. The entity had used its 5 weeks of reconnaissance and destabilization to create a perfect replica of Elena's decision-making patterns. It could now generate thoughts, emotions, and choices that felt completely authentic to her while serving its agenda rather than hers. Elena had become a passenger in her own mind, and the most horrifying part was how natural it felt. What happened next revealed the true horror of advanced spiritual warfare. Elena didn't fight back immediately because the entity's control felt better than her natural state. Under its influence, she was more confident, more decisive, more successful. The entity wasn't trying to destroy her, it was trying to improve her, but on its terms and for its purposes. This is how spiritual colonization works in the modern era. Ancient entities have evolved beyond crude possession tactics. They now offer partnership, enhancement, even genuine improvement in their host's life circumstances. Elena's career was flourishing, her relationships were improving, her anxiety had disappeared. Why would she resist something that was making her life objectively better? Because the improvements came with invisible strings attached. The entity was essentially turning Elena into a spiritual cryptocurrency mining operation. Every positive emotion she experienced, every success she achieved, every moment of happiness or satisfaction was being siphoned off as energetic currency. Elena felt good, but she was being systematically drained of the life force that sustains human consciousness over the long term. The entity had also been studying Elena's social network, using her as a transmission vector to identify and evaluate other potential targets. Through Elena's interactions, it was gathering reconnaissance data on her friends, family, and colleagues. Elena had unknowingly become a spiritual honeypot, attracting other vulnerable individuals into the entity's sphere of influence. But here's what the entity hadn't counted on. Elena's marketing background had taught her to recognize manipulation patterns. Once she realized what was happening, her professional training kicked in. She began analyzing the situation like a campaign strategy, identifying the tactics being used against her and developing countermeasures. Elena started keeping detailed records of every thought that didn't feel completely authentic. She noticed that the entity's influence was strongest when she was emotionally elevated or depleted, extreme states that lowered her psychological defenses. She discovered that certain activities, particularly creative work and physical exercise, created mental static that interfered with the entity's ability to monitor and influence her thoughts. Most importantly, Elena realized that the entity needed her consent to maintain its influence, not conscious, explicit consent, but the subtle psychological surrender that comes from choosing comfort over autonomy. Every time she allowed the entity to make decisions for her because it was easier or more pleasant, she was strengthening its hold on her consciousness. The final revelation was the most disturbing. Elena discovered she wasn't the entity's only current target. Through careful observation, she identified at least 3 other people in her social circle who were exhibiting the same progression of symptoms she had experienced. The entity was running multiple colonization operations simultaneously, building a network of partially controlled individuals who could support each other's continued compliance. Elena faced an impossible choice: maintain her improved life under entity management or reclaim her psychological freedom at the cost of returning to her previous struggles and limitations. This brings us to the third and most important law of spiritual warfare, the consent principle. Spiritual entities cannot maintain long-term control over human consciousness without the host's ongoing psychological consent. They may use deception, manipulation, and false improvement to obtain that consent. But ultimately, free will cannot be permanently overridden without cooperation from the individual. Here's the devastating final analogy that will change how you think about spiritual autonomy forever. Elena discovered that her relationship with the entity was like being married to a psychologically abusive partner who happens to be wealthy, charming, and genuinely helpful. The abuse isn't obvious. It's the gradual erosion of your right to make your own decisions, think your own thoughts, and live according to your own values. The partner provides real benefits: financial security, social status, reduced anxiety. But the price is your authentic self. You can leave anytime, but leaving means giving up all the improvements and returning to your original struggles. Most people choose to stay, convincing themselves that the trade-off is worth it. Elena's choice represents the ultimate spiritual warfare dilemma: comfort versus autonomy. The entity offered genuine improvement in her life circumstances, but at the cost of her psychological sovereignty. It would have been easy to rationalize staying under its influence. After all, she was happier, more successful, and more confident than ever before. But Elena understood that accepting the entity's management meant accepting a fundamentally parasitic existence. She would never know if her achievements were genuinely hers or if her happiness was artificially generated. More importantly, she would never have the opportunity to discover who she could become through her own efforts and authentic choices. The breaking point came when Elena realized the entity was grooming her to recruit others. The final stage of spiritual colonization is turning the host into a harvesting agent for additional targets. Elena would have become a spiritual MLM distributor, unknowingly drawing friends and family into the entity's network. Elena chose freedom, knowing it meant returning to uncertainty, anxiety, and the genuine struggles of human existence. But she also knew it meant reclaiming her right to fail, grow, and become authentically herself. Elena's battle revealed the three-phase progression of modern spiritual predation: mapping, destabilization, and colonization. The entity's sophisticated approach demonstrates that today's spiritual threats don't announce themselves with theatrical supernatural displays. Instead, they offer improvement, partnership, and relief from human struggles. The most dangerous spiritual predators are those that make your life better while slowly erasing your authentic self. Elena escaped because she chose the difficult path of psychological freedom over the easy path of managed existence. The question isn't whether such entities exist, it's whether you'd recognize the choice when it's offered to you. If these spiritual warfare secrets blew your mind, you need to see my next videos. But only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss the most powerful tactics in history. What was your strangest supernatural experience? Leave it in the comments. Send this revelation to that friend who has sharp perception. Now you know the rules of spiritual warfare that most humans never learn. But the question is, will you remember them when you need them most? These stories are inspired by documented spiritual experiences and strategic analysis. Individual experiences may vary. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes, not spiritual counseling.